Peter Thompson was a private in the 7th Cavalry Regiment of the United States Army during the American Indian Wars. He is best known for his eyewitness account of the Battle of Little Bighorn, also known as Custer's Last Stand, which took place on June 25, 1876. Thompson was a member of Company C of the 7th Cavalry, which was part of the battalion led by Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer. During the battle, Thompson became separated from his unit and was forced to hide in a ravine, where he witnessed the fighting and the eventual defeat of Custer's forces. After the battle, Thompson was one of the few survivors and was able to escape and rejoin the remaining forces of the 7th Cavalry. He later wrote a detailed account of his experiences during the battle, which provides valuable insights into the events of that day. Thompson's account is considered one of the most important and reliable eyewitness accounts of the Battle of Little Bighorn, and it has been widely used by historians to reconstruct the events of the battle. But before we begin, be sure to like and subscribe to our channel to support our community. In the morning, air mounting, the companies form in single lines. Each man, commencing at the head of the company, calls out in turn his number: 1, 2, 3, 4, and thus these are repeated until the company is all numbered into sets of 4s. Cavalrymen dismount and fight on foot, save when a charge is made. But when a dismount is ordered, number 4 remains on his horse, whilst numbers 1, 2, and 3 dismount and hand their bridle reins to number 4, who holds the horses whilst they deploy as skirmishers or as otherwise directed. The men composing the 4 with myself were Private John Fitzgerald, Private John Brennan, and Private James Watson. And although comprising one of the sets of 4s that entered into action with Custer, not one of us ever reached the battlefield, which proved fatal to Custer and his men. Both Brennan and Fitzgerald turned their horses toward the rear when they had gone 2 miles beyond the lone teepee. We soon gained the top of the bluffs, whence a view of the surrounding country was obtained. The detail of Company F, which was sent to investigate the teepee, now passed by us on their way to the front with the report that it contained a dead Indian and such articles as were deemed necessary for him on his journey to the happy hunting ground. About half a mile further on, we came in sight of the Indian village, and 'twas truly an imposing sight to anyone who had not seen aught like it before. For nigh on 3 miles on the left bank of the river, the teepees were stretched, the white canvas gleaming in the sunlight. Beyond the village was a black mass of ponies grazing on the short green grass. When the companies came in sight of the village, they gave the regular charging yell and urged their horses into a gallop. At this time, a detail of 5 men from Company F was sent ahead to reconnoiter, and from this point, I was gradually left behind, despite all I could do to keep up with my company. There were others also in the same fix. All urging on my part was useless. Getting vexed, I dismounted and began to fasten on my spurs when I heard my name called, and on looking up, I saw Brennan near me on horseback. He asked, "What is the matter?" I told him that I was afraid my horse was entirely played out. "Well," said he, "let us keep together." I straightened myself up and said, "I will tell you what I will do. I will trade horses with you if you will." He gave me a strange look and turned his horse around and rode towards the rear, leaving me to shift for myself. Well, I thought, I will get along anyway. I finished putting on my spurs, mounted my horse again, and rode on after my company, but my progress was very slow. My spurs, having been poorly fastened, came off again, and being a pair lying on the trail, I dismounted my horse to secure them. Hearing an oath behind me, I looked back and beheld my comrade Watson endeavoring to get his horse on its feet. The poor brute had fallen and was struggling to gain an upright position. Beside him, I saw Sergeant Finkel of our company sitting calmly on his horse, looking on and making no effort to assist Watson in his difficulty. But finally, the poor animal gained its feet with a groan, and Finkel passed on with a rush to overtake our company. By this time, the last of the companies had disappeared over the crest of the hill. I was still tugging away at the spurs when Watson came up and inquired what the trouble was, and then passed on in the trail of the soldiers. I mounted my horse again, but found that a staggering walk was all I could get out of him. I then looked across the river at the Indian village. It was all in commotion. One party of Indians were dashing down the river. Others were rushing toward the upper end of the village. The cause of this commotion was Major Reno with 3 companies of men, about a mile distant from the upper end of the village, dashing along in a gallop towards them. The officers were riding in order, a little in advance of their respective companies. 'Twas a grand sight to see those men charging down upon the village of their enemies, who outnumbered them many times. The well-trained horses were kept well in hand. There was no straggling. They went together, neck and neck, their tails streaming in the wind, and the riders' arms gleaming in the sunlight. 'Twas no wonder that the Indians were in great commotion when they beheld the bold front presented by the cavalry. But alas, how deceptive are appearances! The cavalry dashed into the village, where one of the non-commissioned officers halted and struck up the company's guidon alongside of a teepee before he was shot from his horse. The halt was but for a moment, for the Indians came rushing towards them in great numbers. At this juncture, the dry grass caught on fire, threatening the destruction of the village. But the squaws, fearless as the braves themselves, fought the fire and tore down the teepees which were in danger of burning. Major Reno, seeing that he was greatly outnumbered, ordered an immediate retreat to a grove of cottonwood trees, which stood on the bank of the river about a mile from the upper end of the village, where they found shelter for their horses and protection for themselves. Meanwhile, I was pursuing my way along the trail on foot, leading my horse, for I was afraid he would fall down under me, so stumbling and staggering was his gait. After the disappearance of Custer and his men, I felt that I was in a terrible predicament, to be left practically alone in an enemy's country, leading a horse practically useless. Whilst meditating upon the combination of circumstances which had brought me into this unhappy condition, I looked ahead and saw Watson, but was unable to overtake him, slow as he was going. He suddenly turned aside from the trail, as if he wished to avoid some threatening danger. Whilst I was wondering what it could be, I saw a small party of Indians, about 30 in number, driving a small bunch of ponies and mules, coming toward us. I thought my time had surely come. It was too late to retreat. Whilst I was making calculations as to leaving my horse and trying my luck on foot, I thought I was seeing something familiar in their appearance. On coming close, I saw they were our Re-Scouts and 2 Crow Indians, one of whom was half Yellowface, or 2 Bloody Hands. He had received this latter name from the fact that on the back of his buckskin shirt, the print of 2 human hands was visible, either put there by red ink or blood. When close enough, I gave them to understand the condition I was in, and asked for an exchange of mount. Half Yellowface only shook his head and said, heap shoot, come, and motioned for me to go back with them. I shook my head and answered, no. They made their way to the rear, and I went on ahead. The animals the scouts they had captured from the Sioux. I had lost sight of Watson, and thinking that I could make my horse go faster by mounting, I did so. I had not gone far before I became aware of the fact that I had company. When I had nearly gained the top of the hill, I saw 5 Sioux Indians. We discovered each other about the same time. The other 2 brought their guns to their shoulders and aimed at me. Almost instantly, my carbine was at my shoulder, aiming at them, but it was empty. Whilst in the ranks or on horseback, I made it a practice to carry it empty. There we sat, aiming at one another. The Indians did not fire and I couldn't. True, my revolver was loaded, but I was not fool enough to take my chances, 1 against 5. After aiming at me for a few seconds, they slid off their ponies and sneaked after the other 3. I now looked around to see how I was going to make my escape, for I knew I could not retreat. With 5 I could not cope, and within the last few moments, a few more Indians had gained the trail ahead of me. And to make my way down the face of the bluff, I knew was nearly impossible, as the Indians were climbing up to gain the trail. Looking to my right, I saw a ravine and at the bottom of it a small clump of wild cherry bushes. But beyond and on a higher elevation than on which I stood was a pillar of rocks, which I thought might afford me a means of defense. I knew I would have to act quickly if I was to save my life, so dismounting from my horse, which had carried me so many miles, I dashed down into the ravine toward the bushes, but the sudden flight of a flock of birds from that point caused me to turn aside, and I made a beeline for the pillar of rocks above me. After arriving there, I took inventory of my ammunition. My pistol contained 5 cartridges, my belt contained 17 cartridges for my carbine, a very slim magazine as a means of defense. I had left nearly 100 rounds in my saddlebags, but owing to the incomplete condition of my prairie belt, I was unable to carry more with me. Belts for carrying ammunition were, at this time, just coming into use, and a great many of us had nothing but a small cartridge box as means of carrying our ammunition when away from our horses. I was disappointed with my place of defense. I found that the pillar was barely 18 inches through. It was about 7 feet high, with a piece of rotten cottonwood on top. It had been built by Indians for some purpose or other. After completing my inventory, I sat down and began to reflect on my chances for my life. If I remained where I was, I knew that if the cavalry drove the savages from their village, they would scatter in all directions, and if any of the straggling devils came across such an unfortunate as myself, I would stand a poor show. I looked back toward the trail where I left my horse. He was still in the same place, with an Indian riding around him. I thought that if he was going to be stripped, it was a pity that the ammunition I had left should fall into the hands of an enemy. I thought that my time for acting had again arrived, and that I had better seek other quarters, so I determined that I would try to reach the trail where it made a turn toward the river. I began to make tracks once more in a lively manner, and in a short time reached the point I had started for. At this point, the trail was washed very badly on both sides as it descended towards the river. I looked back and saw a mounted Indian coming full speed after me. The trail I was on led directly to the river and thence into the village. The commotion in the village had subsided. The signs of life were few. It appeared to me that it was deserted, so quiet and deathlike was the stillness. But when I looked closer, I could see a few Indians sneaking around here and there, and every once in a while, an Indian would dash out of the village, as if anxious to get to some given point in the least possible time. Whilst making these observations, I also made a pleasant discovery. Down at the foot of the hill I was descending, I espied a white man riding in a slow, leisurely way. Suddenly, he left the trail and made his way up the river. Wishing to have company, I was about to call for him to stop, but happily for me, I did not, for I saw the reason why Watson, for such he proved to be, turned aside. He was making his way towards a party of Indians who were standing close to the riverbank, near a clump of underbrush. They were talking and gesticulating in a very earnest manner. The day was extremely warm, but for all that, the Indians had their blankets wrapped around them. Some of the blankets were stamped with the large letters ID, meaning Indian Department. I knew then they were some of the hostiles we were after. Watson had evidently not made this discovery. I was anxious to save him, and if I did, I must act quickly. So, leaving the trail, I ran down the hill at full speed and came to a place where there was a deep cut with steep sides that I would not have dared to face had I been able to check myself in time, but I could not. So I gave a leap, which landed me many feet below, and strange to say, I did not lose my balance. Fortunately for me, the soil was soft and loose to light upon. When I got close enough to Watson, I called to him in a guarded voice. On hearing me, he checked up his horse and looked around. I rushed up to him and asked him where he was going. He answered, "To our scouts, of course." I then told him when he passed our scouts on the trail above. "Well," said he, "who are those ahead of us?" I told him I was under the impression that they were hostiles and that we had better keep clear of them. He came to the same conclusion. The problem that now perplexed us was what we were to do. We finally concluded to enter the village by way of the trail. "And now, Watson," said I will help myself along by hanging to your horse's tail, as I cannot otherwise keep up with you." So we started in the proposed direction. We had not gone far before we saw a sight that puzzled us very much. Coming out of the river was one of our Crow scouts, mounted on his horse with the end of a rawhide rope over his shoulder, which he held firmly in his right hand. At the other end of the rope, straining and tugging to get away, was a Sioux squaw. The rope was tied around both her hands, but, struggle as she might, she could not break away. While looking on and wondering where the Crow was going, we were further astonished by seeing General Custer dash out of the fording place and ride rapidly up to the Crow and commence to talk to him. Custer was well versed in several Indian languages. The conversation with the Indian did not last long, and what the nature of it was, I do not know. But the Crow released the Sioux woman, and she seemed glad to be free. She came running towards us in a half-stooping posture, and in her hand was a long-bladed knife of ugly dimensions. So fierce did she look that my hand involuntarily sought the handle of my revolver. She must have noticed the movement, for she made a short circle around us, ran over the bank, crossed the river, and disappeared in the village. The crow then left Custer and rode in a jog, trot towards the river, and disappeared. Custer was mounted on his sorrel horse, and it being a very hot day, he was in his shirt sleeves, his buckskin pants tucked into his boots, his buckskin shirt fastened to the rear of his saddle, and a broad-brimmed cream-colored hat on his head, the brim of which was turned up on the right side and fastened by a small hook and eye to its crown. This gave him opportunity to sight his rifle while riding. His rifle lay horizontally in front of him. When riding, he leaned slightly forward. This was the appearance of Custer on the day that he entered his last battle, and just 1/2 hour before the fight commenced between him and the Sioux. When the Crow scout left him, he wheeled around and made for the same point in the river where we had first seen him. When he was passing us, he slightly checked his horse and waved his right hand twice for us to follow him. He pointed down the stream, put spurs to his horse, and disappeared at the ford, never uttering a word. That was the last I ever saw of Custer alive. He must have gone thence directly to his command. We wondered why none of his staff were with him. In all probability, he had outrun them. His being alone shows with what fearlessness he traveled about even in an enemy's country with hostiles all around him. We reached the fording place as soon as possible, but all signs of Custer were gone. Whether he had gone through the village or waded down the stream to reach his command is a question that cannot be answered. But as we had seen no signs of him crossing to the opposite side, we naturally thought that he had made his way down the stream. When we came to the fording place, we found that the water was rushing very rapidly. Both banks were wet with the splashing made by the animals going to and from the village. We stopped a moment to consider the best way to proceed and how to act. When we looked into the village, we could see the guidon fluttering in the breeze. This was the flag which had been placed there by the corporal just before he was shot. The sight of this increased our courage. Our plan was for Watson to cross the river, first to show how deep the water was. Being very thirsty, I forgot everything else and stooping down, began to dip water from the river in my hands and drink. While I was thus engaged, and when Watson had forded to the middle of the stream, I heard the crack of 3 rifles, which caused me to straighten up quickly and look around to see what the trouble was. Standing on the opposite bank of the river, and at the very point we wished to gain, were 3 Indians, with their smoking rifles in their hands. Watson, looking around at me, said, "What in thunder is the matter?" I answered, "If you don't get off your horse at once, you will get shot." He did not need a second bidding, neither did he dismount in military style, but more like a frog landing with feet and hands in the water at the same time. This ungainly dismount caused the water to fly in every direction. The Indians, no doubt, thought that they had finished him, for 2 of them turned and disappeared in the village. The one that was left stood facing me, still disputing our passage across the river. From his decorations of paint and feathers, I judged he was a chief. Watson began to crawl out of the water. If he was as thirsty as I was before he dismounted, I will guarantee that he was in that condition no longer. I made up my mind to climb to the top of the bank and let drive at our painted friend. I called to Watson to keep quiet for a few moments and began to walk backwards up the bank, keeping my eyes fixed on the Indian and watching his every movement. When he saw my maneuvers, he took aim at me and shot. But the only result was that the lead lay buried in the red clay at my side. The bank being very wet, my feet slipped from under me several times. The Indian, without lowering his rifle, blazed away a second time, with the same result as before. I began to get very angry and climbed to the top of the bank in no dignified manner. The Red Devil still kept aiming at me. I was a better target for him now than before. When I thought it time for him to fire, I dropped to my left side. The bullet, whistling over my head, buried itself in the bluff behind me. As this duel had been one-sided so far, I determined to try my hand. So, loading my carbine, which was done in a moment, I took aim at him as he turned to go to his pony, which was about 30 feet back of him on a slight elevation, winding up his rawhide rope as he did so. I fired, but missed him because Watson, who was on the line with the Indian, made a movement which distracted my aim. I threw open the breech lock of my carbine to throw the shell out, but it was stuck fast. Being afraid that the Indian would escape, I worked at it in a desperate manner and finally got it out far enough to use my thumbnail, which proved effective. The cartridge was very dirty, a nice predicament for a man to be in when at close quarters with an enemy. I was careful to put in a clean one next time, and calling Watson to remain quiet for a moment, I fired when the Indian was within 3 feet of his horse. The ball plowed through his body and buried itself in the ground under the horse, throwing the dirt in every direction. The Indian threw up his hands and fell with his head between the legs of his pony. It may seem hard to take human life, but he had been trying to take mine, and self-preservation is the first law of nature. When I fired this shot, Watson jumped to his feet and began to lead his horse out of the stream toward me. I asked him if his horse was not played out. He said it was. In that case, I told him that he had better leave it, as it would take us all our time to take care of ourselves. He studied for a moment and then waded out of the stream, leaving his horse with everything on it as I had done. After he joined me, we had a consultation as to the best course for us to pursue. It was clear that the Indians still held the village, and it would be foolish for us to again attempt to enter it. To wade downstream was an impossibility. We finally decided to go down the right bank of the stream and see if we could not get sight of Custer's command and join our ranks where we were much needed. Watson cast a last fond look at his horse, and then we started on our perilous journey. We saw plenty of Indians on our side of the stream. They seemed to get bolder and more numerous, but so far they were some distance away. We kept very close to the underbrush, which lined the bank of the river. Suddenly, a small band of Indians came up towards us on a jog trot, which made us seek cover. When they had passed, we moved on our way. Again, we were sent to cover by the approach of more Indians. No doubt, they were coming this way in order to enter the village by the ford. We concluded to seek some sheltered nook to cover ourselves from the extreme heat of the sun and to wait until the Indians had quieted down, for they were beginning to be like a swarm of bees. They were coming from every direction, so unlike what they were a half an hour previous when they were first surprised by the 7th Cavalry. For surprise it must have been to them, but now they were beginning to recover themselves. After they had driven Major Reno across the river, we noticed that the village was beginning to teem with life. The herd of ponies, which had been grazing at quite a distance, were now rounded up close to the teepees, so that the Indians had available mounts. Ponies were dashing here and there with their riders urging them on. The dust would rise and mingle with the smoke of the burning grass and brush. The squaws had got the fire under control and had it confined to a comparatively small space. We managed to secret ourselves in a bend of the river, which turned like the letter S and gave us running water on 3 sides of us. In a clump of red berry bushes, we found a log, which made quite a comfortable seat for us. Peering through the brush, I thought I recognized the horse which Billy Jackson, our guide, had ridden. One of its hind legs was fearfully gashed by a bullet. I called Watson's attention to it, but he did not think it was the same horse. He had met Jackson when on the trail on the top of the hill, but a short distance from the place where it turned towards the village. He said Jackson was in a fearful state of mind. Watson asked him what was the matter. He replied, "Have you seen Custer?" Watson, surprised, answered, "No," and again asked what was up. Then Jackson informed him that Custer had shot at him, cutting away the strap that connected his stirrup to the saddle, and in order to save his life, he had ridden away. Watson said he saw that the stirrup strap was broken off, and Jackson, without any hat, presented a wild appearance. He cast fearful glances around him, as in mortal terror. Suddenly, he put spurs to his horse and rode away, his long hair streaming in the wind, and looking right and left, as if expecting his enemy to appear at any moment. And the strangest part of it, added Watson, was that instead of taking the back trail, he struck straight from the river across the country, and as far as he could see him, he was urging his pony to its utmost speed. I then asked Watson if that did not account for Custer's presence away from his command. He shook his head and said he did not know. We had barely been concealed for 10 minutes when we heard a heavy volley of rifle shots downstream, followed by scattered firing. I stood up and parted the brush with my gun, careful to avoid the long, sharp thorns that covered the stalks and made it disagreeable for my clothes and skin. Looking through the opening, I saw Custer's command drawn up in a battle line, 2 men deep, in a half circle, facing the Indians who were crossing the river above and below them. The Indians remained mounted while fighting, while the cavalry dismounted. The horses were held back behind and inside the circle of skirmishers. The odds were against the soldiers, who were greatly outnumbered and fought at a disadvantage. Their ammunition was limited, with each man supposed to carry 100 rounds of cartridges, but many had wasted theirs by firing at game along the route. Watson pulled me down, urging me to be careful, as the Indians might see me, and drew my attention to the village, which was in a state of turmoil. Indians were leaving the village to assist in the fight, while others were arriving from the battlefield with dead and wounded. A perfect howl erupted from one end of the village to the other, made by the squaws and papooses. The noise grew louder and almost unbearable until it died out, only to be renewed when more dead or wounded were brought in. I couldn't remain still and got to my feet again. The firing was continuous, and I removed my hat to avoid attention. I looked over the panorama before me and saw that the fight was well underway. Hordes of savages had gained a footing on the right bank of the river and driven the soldiers back. The Indians rode in a circle, reloading as they turned, and fired at the cavalry. The well-formed ranks of the cavalry inflicted heavy casualties, and I saw ponies and riders tumbling in the dust. Riderless ponies raced away in every direction, anxious to escape the scene. Cavalrymen were also falling, and their ranks gradually melted away, but they bravely faced their foes. The cavalry fought for $13 a month, while the Indians fought for their families, property, and glory. It seemed each side desired to utterly exterminate the other. Round and round rode the savages in a seemingly tireless circle. When one fell, either dead or wounded, he was carried from the field. But there remained plenty to take his place. However, if a soldier fell, there was no one to take his place, and if wounded, no one to bring him water to quench his thirst. If dying, no one to close his eyes. It was a sad, sad sight. Lucky indeed was that soldier who died when he was first shot, for what mercy could he expect from a Sioux? If their enemy fell into their hands wounded or dying, it was simply to be put to the worst torture possible. Being in our present predicament, we were utterly powerless to help as we wished we could. We knew our duty, but to do it was beyond our power. Look where we could, we saw Indians. We too on foot could not cope with scores of them on horseback. During the fight between Custer and the Sioux, scores of Indians had stationed themselves on the bluffs overlooking the village as far as we could see, so that any movement on our part would have led to our discovery. Nevertheless, we made up our minds not to remain long in our present place of concealment. So we began to map out a course by which we could join our command, where we felt we were so much needed. We found that we had made a mistake and had taken a wrong trail. The trail we had followed had been made by buffalo when going to and from the river. Both Watson and myself had failed to notice the trail made by the cavalry in making their efforts to reach the lower end of the village. And thus we were brought to the fording place near the center of the village. A person could easily be mistaken, for the road over which they passed was rocky, sandy, and hard. Consequently, the marks left by the horses' feet were very faint. Notwithstanding, this mistake left us in a very critical condition. Looking in the direction of the battle, I saw that the cavalry were being driven towards the foot of a small hill, their number greatly reduced. The firing was growing less every minute, but the Indians still kept up their seemingly tireless circling, making a great cloud of dust. The Indians who seemed to be detailed to bring in the dead and the wounded were continually coming into the village with double burdens, showing that the soldiers, though greatly decreased in numbers, were still doing effective work. The squaws and papooses now kept howling without intermission. The noise they made resembled the howling of a coyote and the squealing of a cat. Watson remained deep in thought during our concealment, seemingly arriving at one conclusion. The 7th Cavalry would be defeated. He stated, "The Indians greatly outnumber the soldiers. We have seen more Indians, twice the combined strength of the 7th, while we've been here." I couldn't bring myself to believe such an outcome, but Watson persisted, saying, "It's no use talking. They're going to get the worst of it." I remained equally convinced that the cavalry would emerge victorious. Our plan was to climb the right bank of the river, gain the cavalry's trail, and join our company if possible. However, this undertaking was foolish, as the bluffs nearby made it impassable. Undeterred, we left our retreat and moved down to the cut in the bank. I felt exceedingly thirsty and proposed having a drink. After quenching my thirst, I noticed 3 Indians on the bluff above us, but we felt capable of handling them. We began our ascent, keeping close to the cut bank. Halfway up, I hesitated upon seeing several Indians peering at us over the edge of the bluff, 8 in total. I concluded they were too numerous for us to handle, especially given the uphill terrain. One of them rose and beckoned us to advance in a friendly manner, but I knew he was hostile. I called out to Watson to run, and we both fled at full speed, keeping an eye on the Indians as they prepared to fire. I urged Watson to stretch his stride, and he gradually left me behind. The Indians fired their rifles, with the usual result. One of the Indians mounted his pony and rode on the edge of the bluff abreast of us, jerking off his blanket and waving it in a peculiar manner, shouting out some lingo to those in the village and then pointing towards us. We felt we were discovered. It was our intention to hide ourselves in our former place of concealment, but the Indians were watching us. Thus, passing it, we came back again to the fording place. We looked to see if the horse was still there, but there was no trace of it. No doubt it had passed into the hands of the Indians. Passing the ford on the run, we came to some underbrush. When we slowed down to a walk, Watson still being some distance ahead of me, I now heard the clatter of hoofs behind me. On looking around, I saw a white man and what I supposed to be a Crow Indian. I called for Watson to stop and told him that we had friends coming. I turned around, intending to wait until they came up. No sooner had I faced them than they stopped, turned their horses across the trail, dismounted, threw their guns across their saddles, and took aim at us. To say that we were astonished would faintly express our feelings. There was nothing left for us to do but run. The trail we were on ran through a thick clump of bushes, and we put our best foot first in order to gain its shelter. But before we could reach it, they fired at us but, as usual, missed. But the twigs and leaves were cut by the bullets, and we came to the conclusion that we were not to be killed by the Indians. But if we were not wounded in our bodies, we were in our feelings. We determined to ambush them if they attempted to pursue us. We followed the trail for several hundred feet, then forced our way through the brush, and with our revolvers cocked, lying at our feet, and our guns in our hands, we waited and watched for their appearance. But we waited in vain. They must have suspected our intentions. One thing we made up our minds to do, that was to kill the white man, even if the Indian escaped. We had been 2 hours and a half in our concealment in the bend of the river, watching the fight between Custer and the Indians. It had taken us 1/2 hour to reach this place, making 3 hours in all. The firing in the direction of the battlefield had just now ceased, showing this act of the tragedy was ended. The question may be asked why we attempted to join our commands after 2 hours and a half. My answer is a sense of duty and love for our comrades in arms. Then others may ask why we did not go sooner. We were repulsed at the ford. We were surrounded by Indians on the bluffs. We were without horses, and when we did make the attempt, we did so at nearly the cost of our lives. We were now undecided which way to go. We knew we were surrounded by Indians and would be very fortunate if we escaped at all. The noise in the village was as great as ever, which told us that the Indians still held it. We were ever on the alert, but could see very little on account of the underbrush. I ventured to rise myself and scan the top of the bluffs to see if there were any Indians in sight. But I could not see any, and this puzzled me very much. But on looking down to the lower end of the bluffs, I could see a body of men on horseback mounting slowly up the trail on top of the bluffs. Then I saw several guidons fluttering in the breeze, which I knew as the ones which our cavalry carried on the march. I called Watson's attention to the approaching horsemen, but he was firmly convinced that they were Indians. I then drew his attention to the orderly manner in which they moved, and the guidons they carried, and told him that we better try to join them before they passed us. "Well," said he, "let's move." So we started, following the trail until we were entirely clear of the brush, and then began to climb the face of the bluff in order to reach the trail on which we saw the cavalry were moving. We had scarcely got clear of the underbrush before we became aware of the fact that we had run into a hot place. Before we reached the foot of the bluff, we came upon an opening in the timber and brush with several large cottonwood trees lying upon the ground, stripped of their bark. They had undoubtedly been cut down by the Indians during some severe winter when the snow was very deep and the ponies had to live upon the bark, not being able to get the grass. Near the water's edge, some distance up the river, we saw a large body of Indians holding a council, and that we might avoid them, we kept as close to the cover of the brush as possible and went as rapidly as we could towards the face of the bluff. So intent were we in our endeavor to escape the attention of the Indians by the river that we did not perceive another party which was in the road we wished to take until the guttural language of the savages called our attention to them. I jumped behind one of the fallen cottonwood trees. Where Watson went, I could not at the time tell. I peeped over the fallen tree and saw a group of mounted Indians gesticulating, grunting out their words, and pointing towards the advancing cavalry. Suddenly, they broke up and advanced toward my place of concealment. I began to think they had seen me and crouched as close to the tree as possible. Drawing my revolver, I made ready to defend myself. I made up my mind that all but one shot should be fired at the Indians, and that one would go into my head, for I had determined never to be taken alive. With open ears and eyes, I awaited their coming. They passed my hiding place without seeing me and made their way toward the river. I jumped to my feet and started off at once, hardly caring whether the Indians saw me or not, for the presence of the cavalry had put fresh courage into me. I had not gone far before I heard my name called, and on looking around I saw Watson coming after me at full speed. I was glad to see him safe. It gave me renewed courage, and we hoped that we would soon be entirely safe. After we began to climb the hill, I found my strength was giving out, and in spite of the fact that we were in full view of the Indians, I laid down to rest, and all my entreaties for Watson to go on and save himself were fruitless. He would not budge. But there was something that made us move sooner than I wished. A large body of Indians had crossed the river and were coming across the flat toward the hill we were climbing. I struggled to my feet and staggered after Watson. The heat at this time seemed to be intense, but it might have been on account of my exhausted condition. Watson made no complaint, for like myself, he knew it would do no good. After we had climbed nearly halfway up the bluff, the Indians commenced to fire at us, but that did not trouble us, because we knew that the Indians, when excited, were very poor shots, and in our case the bullets went wide of the mark. We were becoming so tired that the presence of the Indians was no longer a terror to us. The hill we were climbing seemed very long, so much so to me that I fell down and lay there without any inclination to move again, until Watson called my attention to the head of the column of cavalry which now came into plain view. So with renewed energy we made our way up amid showers of lead. The savages seemed loath to let us go. When we stepped out into the trail at the head of the advancing column, it was approximately 5 o'clock in the afternoon. The first individual we recognized was Sergeant Knipe of our company, who had been dispatched by Custer to expedite the ammunition. The forces under Major Reno, at the time we stepped into the trail, comprised 6 companies of the left wing and 1 company of the right, namely Company B under the command of Captain McDougal. Sergeant Knipe then informed me that my horse had been found and was in the care of Fitzgerald, the horse farrier. Knipe added, "They all thought you was a goner." This was indeed welcome news to me. Just then, the order was given to retreat, and Reno's command began to march slowly to the rear. We all wondered at this decision but refrained from questioning, as it was our duty to obey. I hastened through the retreating column in search of my horse and found it in the center of the command, led by Fitzgerald, who seemed greatly astonished at seeing me, exclaiming, "I thought the Indians had your scalp." I retorted that I was too adept a runner for that. Upon examining my saddle, I was relieved to find everything as I had left it. We did not retreat far, for that was impossible, as the Indians were closing in around us. Our retreat was covered by Company D, commanded by Captain Weir, who had ardently desired to go to Custer's relief. He had begged in vain to have Reno advance to Custer's aid and, being denied, requested permission to take his company and ascertain Custer's position, but was refused that privilege. Major Reno moved to the left of the trail and entered a flat-bottomed ravine. By this time, the Indians were pouring a shower of lead into us that was exceedingly galling. Our horses and mules were huddled together in one confused mass, tired and hungry. Where we made our stand, there was naught but sand, gravel, and a little sagebrush. We were in a precarious condition, with poor means of defense. Numerous ravines led into the one we occupied, affording the savages an opportunity to close in on us, which they promptly did. Some of us unloaded the mules of the hardtack they carried and utilized the boxes as a breastwork, knowing that if we did not, we would be picked off one by one. We formed the cracker boxes into a half circle and kept them as close together as possible. When we finished getting ready, the sun was setting. We knew Indians don't fight at night, so we thought we had time to prepare before morning. But some bad things happened, making our situation worse. Our horses and mules were getting killed because they were exposed. This was hard for us cavalrymen, as we cared deeply for our horses. A strange accident happened to a man next to me. He was talking cheerfully behind a cracker box when a bullet hit him and killed him instantly. He had placed the box wrong, with the edge facing out. It was a tragic mistake, and we were all shocked by his sudden death. As I thought about life's uncertainty, a bullet hit the box behind me. I wondered if my time was up, but the bullet stopped, and I felt relieved. I was glad night was falling, and we would have some cover from the darkness. I wandered to the edge of the bluff, overlooking the village. By this time, it was quite dark. I could plainly see several large fires which the Indians had built. There was a noise in the village, which increased as night advanced. The deep voices of the braves, the howling of the squaws, the shrill piping of the children, and the barking of the dogs made night hideous, but they appeared to enjoy it amazingly. Suddenly, we heard above all other sounds the call of a bugle. The sound came from the direction of the village, and immediately following was the sound of two others. The officers hearing those bugles sound ordered our buglers to sound certain calls and waited to see if they would be answered. The only answer was a long wailing blast. It was not what was expected. I then turned around and made my way to the place where my dead horse lay and stripped the saddle of everything, then went and made my bed behind my cracker box. The last thing I heard as I lay down upon the ground was the howling of the Indians and the wailing of the bugles. I slept so soundly that I heard and knew nothing until I felt someone kicking the soles of my boots. Jumping to my feet, I saw Captain Benteen standing by my side. When he saw that I was fully awake, he told me I would have to render some assistance at the head of the ravine up which the Indians were trying to sneak. He added, "If they succeed, it will be a sad day with us." The Indians had been firing volleys at us for some time before I awoke, and they continued to do so. Under the cover of darkness, they had gained a foothold in the numerous ravines surrounding us. It seemed impossible to dislodge them. Some were so close that their fire was highly effective. The sound of bullets and the groaning of wounded horses was oppressive. However, my duty was clear. I had to reach my post, which was up a short hill towards the edge of the bluff and the head of the ravine. As I prepared my ammunition, I glanced up at the direction I had to go, and I couldn't see how I could possibly get there alive. The Indians' bullets were everywhere, plowing up the sand and gravel, but it was my duty to try. After getting everything ready, I started running. The Indians' fire seemed to come from 3 directions, and all exposed places were riddled with bullets. Even our breastwork was no longer safe. The Red Devils seemed determined to crush us. As I ran up the hill, I felt a tendency to shrink up, fearing I'd be struck in the legs or feet. I wasn't the only one running for the head of the ravine. Captain Benteen was gathering men to go to the same point, to keep the Indians in check and possibly drive them out. It didn't take me long to reach the top of the bluff, where I saw the village, the river, and the mouth of the ravine. I thought I'd make it through safely, but as I entered the ravine, the Indians fired a volley, and I fell, shot through the right hand and arm. Below me, I saw 11 cavalrymen, a slim force to clean out the ravine held by many Indians. But they were resolute men. Captain Benteen joined them and made a short speech. "This is our only weak point," he said. "If the Indians pass through, they'll soon end the matter for us." He asked, "Are you ready?" They answered, "Yes." "Then charge down there and drive them out," he said. With a cheer, they dashed down, revolvers in one hand and carbines in the other. Benteen walked away to the left, seemingly tireless and unconscious of the hail of lead around him. Knowing that in my condition I was useless, I looked around to see if I could find anyone who could direct me to a surgeon. I knew that there were 2 with General Custer, but I was not sure whether we had one with us here or not. A short distance from me lay a wounded man, groaning and struggling in the agony of death. Just as I was thinking of getting up, I heard an order given by a Sioux chief. A heavy volley of bullets was the result. My wounded neighbor gave a scream of agony and lay still. After the volley was past, it was a wonder to me how I had escaped. I now struggled to my feet, and found that I was weak and dizzy from the loss of blood. I looked around me and saw what remained of those who had gone down the ravine against such fearful odds. Few of them returned, but they had accomplished their object. We had men with us who seemed utterly fearless in the face of danger. One young man had the courage of a lion. Wherever duty called him, whatever the danger might be, he was always at his post. Going in the direction of the horses, I saw what suffering the poor brutes were enduring from thirst and hunger, but we ourselves were no better off. I found in the center of our place of defense that we had a surgeon busily attending to the wounded and dying. I asked him to attend to me when he had time to do so. He soon bandaged up my wounds and told me the only thing that could be done was to apply plenty of water. What mockery! Water was not to be had for love or money. Our way to the river was cut off excepting by way of the ravine out of which 11 brave men drove the Indians. But to attempt to get water by that route was too risky. I looked on while the doctor attended the wounded that were brought in. Some of the poor fellows would never recover, others would be crippled for life, and I would carry a broken hand. The sun reflecting on the sand and gravel made it very hot. The loss of blood and the lack of water made me so dizzy that I reeled and fell and lay unheeded. But this was getting to be a common sight. I still clung to my carbine and revolver. When I fell, I managed to roll over on my face and place my carbine under me. I knew that if anyone needed such an implement, they were liable to take it. I do not know how long I lay there, but I have a faint recollection of being turned and my gun taken from me. This aroused me, and I managed to struggle to a sitting posture, but the man and the gun were gone. He had left his own in its place, but it was practically useless, the breech being broken. As I pondered the meanness of human nature, I saw Captain Benteen dash into the midst of our horses and drive out several men who were hiding and skulking about them. "Get out of here," he cried, "and do your duty." It soon became known that the Indians were concentrating for an attack upon our lines. They had closed in around us on 3 sides, and so close were they that we could hear them talking. Captain Benteen seemed aware of the impending danger and was forming all the men he possibly could into line at the point where it was expected the Indians would attack us. The heat of the day was oppressive, and the guns of the Indians were silent, bringing a feeling of depression over us. We all realized that our lives were not worth betting on, but the expression on the faces of the men was that of a dogged determination to sell them dearly. We had 2 spades, the others having been either broken or lost, so our means of digging rifle pits were limited, and natural defenses there were none. History hardly records a predicament such as we were in. It does mention the hardships of the soldiers of the late Civil War, but campaigning against the Indians is far worse. A white man capturing an enemy usually spares his life, but if captured by hostile Indians, his days are numbered, and he is known of men on earth no more. How are we going to transport our wounded? We had plenty of them, and some of them very badly hurt. Look where you would, you could see either dead or wounded soldiers, and the end was not yet in sight. The silence was suddenly broken by a loud command given by a hostile chief, followed by a terrific volley, and a great many of our horses and mules passed over the range. Our men never wavered but hugged the ground as close as possible and fired whenever they found the slightest opportunity to do execution. All realized that the less ammunition expended, the better. Although the Indians outnumbered us many times, they lacked the courage and determination of the day previous when they fought Custer. They no doubt had been taught a bitter lesson. Had it not been for the watchfulness of our men, they certainly would have got the best of us. Wherever they attacked, our men were always ready. While the hottest of the fight was going on, and the tide of battle seemed against us, our doctor dropped his bandages and grasping a gun started toward the skirmish line. Some of the men, seeing his action, begged him to stay, telling him that it would go hard with the command if anything should go wrong with him. And to enforce their arguments, a wounded man was brought in who needed his immediate attention. This, for a time, seemed to deter him, for he laid down his gun and commenced work at his former occupation. He was kept very busy for some time. I made my way slowly over the small area where we huddled together and was pleased to see some men stretching canvas over the wounded and dying. The officers had brought this canvas for their own use, but they gave it up for the humane purpose of sheltering the helpless. The canvas had to be stretched very close to the ground, using short pieces of wood as supports. We had no use for firewood, even if we could have gotten it, as we had no water to cook with. Hence, our wounded were deprived of the comforts a sick man needs. As I strolled around, I saw the horrors of our position. It was not a question of days, but of hours. We could probably bury our comrades who had fallen in battle, but it would be impossible to dispose of dead horses and mules. The stench would become so great that it would drive us from our present position, and where were we to go? It was utterly impossible to move our wounded, as we had no means to do so. We were willing to change our location if we could, but we hesitated for several reasons. We were separated from our leader, and our forces were divided. The Indians seemed determined to exterminate us if possible. Our only hope was to make an effort after night came on. I wondered if any other members of Company C had been as unfortunate as myself. Although that company had entered the fight with General Custer, a few had been detailed to the pack train, so I commenced to search around for them. I first found a man named Bennett, whom I respected. I could see that his days were numbered. Kneeling down beside him, I asked, "Can I do you any service?" "Water, Thompson water. For God's sake," he whispered. Poor fellow, he was past speaking in his usual strong voice. I told him I would get him some if I lived. He released my hand, seeming satisfied, and then I realized what my promise meant. This was the 26th day of June, a day long to be remembered by all who took an active part. As far as getting water was concerned, it was a matter of greatest difficulty. All routes to the river were cut off by the Indians. I was determined to make the effort nevertheless and looked around for a canteen. I thought of the ravine cleared by 11 brave men and hoped I might make my way to the river by that route. I made some inquiries of skulkers I found among the horses, and from what they told me, I concluded that the ravine route was the only safe one to take. In a short time, I secured 2 canteens and a coffee kettle. I made my way to the head of the ravine, which ran down to the river. I found that very little change had taken place since the incident in the morning. The Indian firing was sporadic, allowing me to move around with slightly more comfort. However, I couldn't predict how long this would last. As I reached the rise of ground, I saw a group of men examining an object on the ground, an Indian warrior in full war paint, which contributes to their apparent courage and fierce appearance. He was found very close to our position, indicating how confined we were. The Indians occupied every available natural position due to their numbers. If not for our dire situation, we could have enjoyed a panoramic view of the snow-capped Big Horn Mountains, which form the fountainheads of the Little and Big Horn rivers. While pondering my next move, I was suddenly asked, "Where are you going? And what are you going to do?" by a fellow company member. I expected sympathy, but he tried to dissuade me and informed Sergeant Knipe of my intention to go to the river. The sergeant warned me of the hopelessness of the undertaking, saying I would never return alive if I attempted it. I explained that, unable to carry a gun, I wanted to help the wounded and dying. Seeing my determination, they said no more. Tim Jordan from Company C gave me a large pocket handkerchief to create a sling for my wounded hand. I started down the ravine but halted, realizing I didn't have my pistol belt, which I had given to a comrade. He seemed confused and claimed to have lost it, so I had to console myself with the thought of taking care of it myself. I turned around and made my way through the citizen packers who accompanied us on the expedition. They likely thought their position was the safest way to serve their country. As I descended the ravine, it became narrower, deeper, and more lonesome, naturally making it more depressing. I noticed numerous hoof prints indicating the Indians' desperate attempt to break through our defenses via this route. But now it was deserted. After traveling a considerable distance, I came to a turn in the ravine. Pausing, I looked cautiously around the bend and saw the Little Horn River before me, with a thick cover of cottonwood timber on the opposite side. This made me hesitate, as it was possible that Indians were concealed there to pick off anyone approaching the water. However, I saw no signs of life and decided to proceed. I made my way rapidly toward the riverbank, finding the ground very miry. I was afraid of getting stuck in the mud, but decided to try. I laid down my canteens, took my kettle in my left hand, and made several long leaps, landing me close to the water's edge. The water ran shallow over a sandbar. With a long sweep of my kettle upstream, I succeeded in getting plenty of sand and a little water. As I made my way back towards the mouth of the ravine, a volley of rifle balls whistled past me, and the lead buried itself in the bank beyond. I gained the shelter of the ravine without a scratch and was thankful. I wondered if it would be safe to stop and transfer the water to the canteens, as the Indian fire seemed to come from a bend in the bank. I wasn't sure if the Indians might follow me. Had I been armed, I would have been more at ease. I knew I could travel more easily if I left the kettle behind. So I placed it between my knees and transferred the water to the canteens. As I glanced back from time to time, I endeavored to ascertain if the Indians were in pursuit. Upon rounding the bend of the ravine, I espied no signs of their approach. Although my thirst was quite pronounced, I refrained from partaking of a drink until I had reached the midst of my comrades. I proffered to share the contents of one canteen with several members of Company C, but they declined my offer upon learning that my intention was to succor the wounded brethren of our company. Upon approaching Bennett, I placed a canteen in his hand, but alas, he was too enfeebled to lift it to his lips. He was attended by Private John J. Mahoney of our company, and I had every confidence that he would receive the requisite care. I then proceeded to reconnoiter and discovered 2 additional comrades from our company who had sustained slight injuries. I presented them with the remaining canteen and instructed them to pass it along to other wounded soldiers in the vicinity, should they not require the entirety of the water, which they duly did. A certain trumpeter David McVeigh, to whom I had proffered the canteen for his refreshment, seemed resolved to retain possession of it. I forcibly retrieved it from his grasp and handed it to the next individual. With a cry of ire, he produced his revolver from beneath his overcoat and, taking aim at me, threatened to discharge it unless I vacated the premises forthwith. I was momentarily struck dumb with astonishment, but upon regaining my faculties, I employed my linguistic abilities to the utmost advantage, as they constituted my sole means of defense. Fortunately, I was unarmed, for had I been otherwise, I fear I would have committed an act for which I would have subsequently reproached myself. My actions, however, would have been justified by the laws of self-preservation. The entreaties of the wounded for a draught of water, accompanied by offers of remuneration, were truly heartrending to behold. $10 for a drink, exclaimed one. $15 for a canteen of water, cried a second. $20, shouted a third. And thus the bidding continued, reminiscent of an auction. This spectacle redoubled my determination to undertake another excursion to the river, bearing a more considerable number of canteens, thereby obviating the necessity for multiple journeys. The Indians maintained a brisk and intermittent fusillade, while our own volleys were reserved for occasions when the presence of an Indian was clearly discernible. My subsequent journey to the river was undertaken with increased fortitude. However, upon arriving at the bend in the ravine, I halted and cautiously surveyed the surrounding area. I was astonished to behold a soldier seated upon a bank of earth, facing the river with his back towards me. My curiosity was piqued, and I approached him to ascertain his identity. Upon closer inspection, I observed that he possessed 2 camp kettles, which had been thoroughly perforated by bullets. He grasped his gun and intently watched the grove of timber across the river, vigilantly searching for signs of the enemy. Upon examining him further, I discovered a pool of blood nearby, which had emanated from a grievous wound in his leg. It was evident that he was unable to proceed without assistance. I inquired as to the circumstances surrounding his injury. He recounted that while procuring water from the river, a volley had been fired in his direction, striking him and fracturing his leg below the knee. The remaining bullets had riddled his kettles. Despite his wounds, he had managed to drag himself to the location where I found him. I informed him that it was now my turn to attend to the task at hand. He endeavored to dissuade me, but I remained resolute, refusing to return without water. I laid aside my canteens and grasped the camp kettle from my previous excursion. I proceeded forward, scanning the grove for signs of Indians, but none were visible. I selected a spot where the water was deepest and made a few leaps, landing in the river with a loud splash. I knew it was futile to attempt to conceal myself, so I relied on my agility to evade the Indians' bullets. A volley was fired, but I escaped unscathed. Private Michael P. Madden, the wounded soldier I had just left, watched me with great interest. Upon my return, I urged him to partake in a drink, but he declined, stating that he was not in need of it. This surprised me, as I knew he had lost a considerable amount of blood, which is typically followed by intense thirst. I hastened to fill the canteens and began my journey back to camp, bidding Mike Madden to remain optimistic, to which he responded cheerfully. Upon arriving at our defensive position, I observed that the firing had subsided, with only sporadic shots being exchanged. Our men remained vigilant, ensuring that no vulnerable points were left unguarded and that ammunition was not being squandered. Despite possessing an abundance of ammunition, the men exercised restraint, firing only when they were confident of inflicting damage. Upon departing from the hospital, where I had left 3 canteens for the wounded, I took possession of the remaining 2 and distributed them amongst my injured comrades. Subsequently, I began to feel exceedingly unwell and sought a secluded location to escape the intense heat of the sun. This malady was occasioned by the loss of blood and the excruciating pain in my hand, which had swollen to a considerable size. I eschewed the canvas shelter, already overcrowded with wounded, and instead crawled beneath one of the horses, which stood amidst a group of others. I couldn't help but ponder the precarious situation I would find myself in if the horse beneath which I lay were to be struck and fall upon me. However, this concern soon dissipated, as there was always some occurrence that captured my attention. I commenced observing the actions of the men. A short distance from me lay a soldier belonging to Company A, so still and motionless that I surmised him to be deceased. 2 men approached, dragging a piece of canvas with which they intended to construct a shelter for the ever-increasing number of wounded. Tony, for that was the man's name, lay in the most suitable location for the shelter, and the men called upon him to vacate the area. Yet, he remained immobile. One of the men began to kick him, exhorting him to rise. He struggled to his feet, his countenance beset with fear. He claimed to be indisposed. A more wretched individual would be difficult to find. The man was nearly frightened to death. He stumbled a few paces and collapsed to the ground, heedless of the scorching sun or the surrounding commotion. Another young man was moving about with great purpose, rendering assistance wherever he deemed himself needed. I frequently observed him, and his cheerful demeanor in the face of duty warmed my heart. He was a trumpeter, attached to either Company I or L, and I regret that his name has escaped my recollection. With few exceptions, the soldiers discharged their duties with remarkable bravery and determination. I hope this first-hand account gives you a new perspective on the Battle of Little Bighorn and the Great Sioux War of 1876. Stay tuned for more videos like this. I hope to bring you more first-hand accounts of different battles, so have a great day, and I'll see you next time.